Hello YouTube, Dave here again. So a couple weeks ago I posted a video talking about a fill-in session that I did as a DM for D&D Adventures League. The campaign was running Out of the Abyss, and I just designed a bunch of encounters. And I discussed one of the encounters in particular, which was an encounter against a deranged stone giant. And how the encounter was really one that the players were expected to have to run from. So I got a lot of interesting feedback on that video in terms of people that were sort of against the idea of an encounter where the design or the intent is for the players to run, as well as some people that were really for it. So I actually want to sort of discuss today in this video the ethics of throwing the players against what is considered to be unwinnable encounters, and kind of talk about it, I guess, from a little bit of personal experience, as well as just from, I guess, sort of a history, or the way that the concept of the unwinnable encounter has changed and how thoughts towards it have changed from edition to edition. So one of the things that I really want to preface is that I started playing Dungeons & Dragons during the advanced Dungeons & Dragons days. Now, it was the tail end of 2nd edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but in the AD&D system, the possibility of coming into an encounter that you couldn't win and that you were expected to run from was a common enough occurrence. It wasn't something that happened in every, adventure or every session or anything like that. But the fact of the matter is that the players had sort of a sense of mortality, and there were certain things that you would come across, and depending on your level, you knew that you just weren't going to be able to take. Some of the more current examples, or other ones that I've kind of gone through, was in the Chapter 1 of the Shackled City Adventure Path, Life's Bazaar. There's a part where the player characters encounter a beholder as probably only 2nd level characters. Now, the purpose of that was just a role-playing encounter, or a role-playing interlude in the encounter that they were currently in, and that the beholder was actually a non-combatant. But at the same time, the players, when this, very powerful and deadly monster suddenly appeared, the players kind of stood up and took notice. So again, this is mostly the point of this video is sort of open up discussion on the topic, and there really is no wrong answer for the question of, should you use these types of encounters, or how often should you? It's something that really needs to be tailored to your style as a dungeon master and your player character's kind of play style. For example, if you have players that tend to be cautious enough as it is, the idea of throwing in an encounter which you expect them to run from probably doesn't have to happen, because they're already not being reckless. Whereas other groups, you may feel the need to do so to teach the players a lesson if they kind of rush headlong into everything. Myself personally, I like the use of encounters that are considered to be not necessarily 100% impossible, but very, very deadly encounters. It's something that, shouldn't be abused, in my opinion, or used too frequently, but it is something that I like to use. And I like to have a general sense that, there is danger in the world. I know with, 5th edition and 4th edition, the idea was that the characters really should be mainly fighting encounters that they're expected to be able to win, with, some of the difficult encounters, something that would drain maybe half of their resources, or things along those lines. Even the guidelines for creating what are considered to be deadly encounters in 5th edition, from my point of view, is what I would consider to be a very difficult but not actually deadly. I mean, they consider a deadly encounter to be something where, multiple characters might be knocked to 0, but it's like that's not necessarily deadly, because there's still a very strong chance that they're going to survive, just that they're going to take a lot of damage in getting there. So I guess for me, again, coming from someone who's played a lot of older styles or older editions of Dungeons & Dragons, there were times in a lot of adventures where, the encounters were just what they were, and if you stumbled across an encounter that was too difficult for you, the expectation was that you would run or you would die. For example, Keep on the Borderlands. Classic adventure from the basic day or the basic Dungeons and Dragons rule sets, going back to like the Holmes and Moldvay basic D&D. I played through that, or at least a couple sessions of it, and our group took a wrong turn and we encountered a Minotaur. And we knew that our first level characters were not going to be a match for that Minotaur, so we fled. I've run campaigns myself where I've included encounters that were considered to be more or less not winnable, but make it so that the characters were able to escape. And that's, I guess, the biggest thing that I have as an issue when it comes to unwinnable encounters. There are some times that an unwinnable encounter is thrown at a group and the group doesn't really know or have a clear idea of what they should do. As a dungeon master, as someone when I'm designing my adventures, I want it to be pretty clear that the enemy is likely beyond them, and try to make it known that there is an avenue of escape. So, for example, I mean, the easiest one to go to is that beholder coming into the second level characters, encounter that they were in. They knew that they weren't going to be able to defeat that beholder, so they didn't even try to fight it. Instead, they just kind of stopped, waited for the beholder to get what he came for, and then they picked the fight back up with the creatures that they were having the encounter with before it showed up. In my Eberron campaign, I had the Warforged Berserker that ambushed the party in an attempt to make it look like their lives were in danger, being threatened by Merrick Stakhaneth. So this large Warforged comes down. Its eyes glow red, and it actually flies into a barbarian rage, something that's very much not in line with how Warforged typically act. And this thing was mean. He was big and he was powerful, and it was made pretty obvious that this creature was just going to be too much for them. There was a wooden barricade that had slammed down at the end of the alley that they had come in through, to make it to create that sort of sense of danger. But it was also described as when the wooden barrier landed, that huge cracks formed in the wall as it landed, and a shower of splinters flew out, meaning that it was something that the characters could break their way through and escape. And it's what they ended up doing. The encounter was enough that they could take a hit or two from this berserker without being killed, but when the first hit came down and they realized how much damage it dealt, the idea at that point was to simply flee and to bash their way out of this already heavily damaged barricade that was dropped in place. In the more recent example with the stone giant, it was made quite clear that on the far side of the cavern that it was in was a small tunnel, small enough that most of the player characters would actually have to hunch over in order to get through it, something that an 18-foot tall giant wasn't going to be able to get through. There are also stalagmites dotting the floor all the way throughout the cavern, but large ones that the characters could actually hide behind and take cover behind if need be. So getting back to the idea of should dungeon masters use unwinnable encounters, I think that the answer is yes, but it should be done sparingly, and there should be a payoff for it later on down the road. In the case of the Beholder, for example, he becomes a major villain in the campaign in Shackled City that the characters do eventually face and defeat. With the Warforged Berserkers that I introduced, the first encounter with it was something that was going to be deadly for the characters at the level that they were. But when they came back from Zendrick and were ambushed by a pair of them, they were actually, the encounter was fit for their level, and they were going to be able to defeat them. Now, they were going to take some damage in doing so, and the notable NPC was going to be quote-unquote killed. But the fact of the matter is that the characters who had to run from one of these earlier on in their progression were going to be able to fight and defeat a pair of them now, showing how much more powerful they've become. And I would like to hope that in the Out of the Abyss campaign, that when the characters gain a few more levels, they are able to encounter another stone giant that they can actually fight with and be able to take out reasonably. So that's the main reason why I tend to have unwinnable encounters. It's to get the characters and players I should say, to exercise a little bit of caution. It creates more of a sense of realism in the world too, because even though the characters are heroes, there are going to be things that they're not going to be prepared to fight. And should they come across one of those things that they're not going to be prepared to fight, it's something that they either flee from it and hope to encounter it when they're tougher, or they fight it and suffer heavy losses. I had introduced an aspect of Dagon into my Eberron campaign, and the aspect of Dagon was really to set up a potential adventure for after the main story that I wanted to tell was resolved. So after the characters stopped the ritual and defeated the real Athan Jasan and this undead Titan that was kind of partially restored, if they wanted to continue with those characters, the next thing could be to try to search for this aspect of Dagon and go through and encounter some of its minions and kind of unravel, discover where it is, and go and face it. But again, other times it's just to show the progression that the characters have gone through. I think it is important that players don't expect their characters to be able to simply tank everything that they come across. It can become a little bit too comfortable of a pattern to fall into. And it's, again, something that I would use very, very rarely. Like, for example, in the Eberron campaign that I had run, I had 2 such encounters, and that was probably the heaviest campaign for those unwinnable encounters that I ever ran. Usually it's like 1 early on in the character's progression, levels like 1 through 5, for example. And then after that, they fight mostly things that they're able to take. Now, in 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, the idea was that you should be running what's considered to be an unwinnable or near impossible encounter once out of every roughly 20 encounters, was the way that they had broken it down. Meaning that, roughly 5% of all the encounters that you have are ones that are going to be too powerful for you. Now, I think that that's a little bit too much, and personally, I would only probably use one for like every 10 levels of character progression. If you use them too often, the players are going to start getting frustrated because they feel like they're just never going to be able to overcome the challenges that are being thrown at them. But if you use it too infrequently, then that builds that false sense of invincibility. So for me, if I was running a 20-level campaign, especially of my own design now, I would probably throw in a couple of those types of encounters. So the way that I had done it in my Eberron one is probably the way that I would do it going forward. And again, it would be mostly at the lower levels that this would happen. So the highest level that I think I would have my characters at when they come across an unwinnable encounter is probably 10th or maybe 11th. But once you start getting beyond that point, the characters really should be powerful enough to fight and defeat most things that they come across. I think having it at around 10th level for me is probably a throwback to my days of running Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, where the characters stopped gaining hit dice at 9th level for the most part. So once you got to 10th level, as far as your hit points and stuff were concerned, you weren't that far off from what your conceivable maximum was going to be. Most classes only gained 1 or 2 hit points every level. So, being 13th level versus being 10th wasn't really that big of a difference unless you were, like a spellcaster or something. So I guess the question that I have for you guys is, what are your thoughts on the, impossible or, encounters that are meant to be, run from? Do you use them in your campaigns? Are you morally against them? Do you think that they serve an important purpose? If you use them, do you use them just to teach the players a lesson, or do you use it to kind of show off their progression later on? Like, for example, if they fight or come across something that they can't defeat at low levels, is it your plan to have them encounter something similar once they've gotten to higher levels so they can get the satisfaction of defeating it and sort of overcoming that unwinnable encounter that they had before? How do you use them? Do you use them at all? And just let me know what your thoughts are on them in general, and how often do you think that they should be used? Do you think the 1 in 20 rule is a good one, or do you think it should be a bit more sparingly used than that? Anyway, thank you guys very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you next time. Take care.